So this is a sort of a combination of an exercise in thinking about stuff and an exercise in how do you then pull together some form of a decision-making tool for farmers and advisors in a nutshell. So I'll basically try and skip through some of this and spend a little bit more time on some of the other details. So this is a talk that I've given to a number of groups, largely around advisors and farmer groups, to try and explain things around looking at data and how we can use them for decision making. So I set off with my slide about benchmarking, and this is basically the slide where I say to farmers, I'm not here to tell you how to run your business, I'm just here to try and explain how you can use data to try and identify areas that you might want to explore further. And for me, that's all you can do with the types of data that we have on farm business data. So that's basically the top part of it. And a lot of the benchmarking stuff that I've been involved in for farmers and advisors has been very much at the business level, a little bit at production level, but largely at business level. And then what we're moving to really with this piece of work is thinking more about the environmental side of things and more about the social side of things, which is something that came out of a UK government-funded project around this topic of sustainable intensification. How do we get more from less? And some of the issues that I'll cover are really all around data, and who do I compare myself with. So that's basically the issues that we were looking at. So context-wise, sustainable intensification, the way we sort of looked at this, well, when I started to think about it, we talked about sustainable intensification, making more from less, or getting the same out of less inputs, doing less harm, doing more good, those sorts of things. But the concept in anybody's mind is so much easier than the implementation of it. Implementing sustainable intensification is really hard. Thinking about it can be quite easy. And it's largely around the fact that when we think about agriculture, it's just really complicated. And people like to think of it and think of its simplicity, but actually it's really difficult. We have multiple metrics involved in any production and environmental activity. If we're going to manage anything, and within a scientific field, if we're going to manage it, we need to understand some numbers. So how do we do that? So when we started to think about sustainable intensification, we thought, well, we could measure everything. And by that, we literally mean going to fields and measuring nitrate runoff and those kinds of things, measuring worm counts or bird counts or whatever it might be. That would become really expensive and people would be turned off from that. Or we took a different approach, which is, can we measure some things that we know about, and then can we go through a process of data augmentation and effectively transforming the data that we have into something else. So that's the sort of approach that we took, and that's the approach I'm going to be talking you through. So how can we measure and manage this process while minimizing a data burden for managers and advisors? So the augmentation approach that we've sort of went through with this project is using farm business survey data. So just to explain what that data is, the Farm Business Survey from a UK perspective has been running since 1936. It's an annual business and production survey of farmers across the UK. In England, we have 1,750 farmers each year. We have about a 90% retention rate, and we do a full business and production analysis on each of those farms. So we have this massive data set, annual data set on a range of farm types spread all around the country to a high degree of information, all to set protocols. We took that production and financial data and we integrated it with our sustainable intensification partner models. So there are various organisations on the bottom here. So one of them was ADAS, and they'd previously developed a tool for looking at some environmental metrics from agriculture. So we joined with them and we said, well, let's use your tool. Let's throw some of our farm business survey data into your tool. Let's go back and look at IPCC data. So we set off and looked at tier 1 coefficients of how do we transform some of these production data into environmental outcomes. And then we said, right, well, let's just look and see what variation we get in our outputs from our farm business survey data when we've augmented it. Does it make any sense? How happy would we be with it? To some extent, we were happy, with others we weren't. And I'll touch on a little bit of this, but philosophically, one of the things that I always like to highlight with this concept is this unit of measurement issue, because people talk about sustainable intensification and environmental outcomes, and they talk about things and they go, but, you know, per hectare, this is really bad. And I'm going, yeah, okay. Or per cow, this is really good. And I'm going, well, maybe. And it depends what you're trying to measure. So if you're trying to measure a nitrate runoff, you might need to worry about this, because the locality might be really damaged by your runoff from your production system. But if you're worried about greenhouse gas metrics, does per hectare matter? Does it mean anything? Or what should we be measuring? And so should we be moving to something that's more around measuring an outcome per calorie of what we're consuming, or some other metric? So actually understanding what the divider is in this context, I think, really makes a difference to what the outcome you might want to achieve. Because I have organic farmers who say how brilliant they are about producing certain agricultural outputs in their environmental context, and then I start talking to them about this or this, and I compare them to conventional farmers, and then they go, oh, well, okay, I'm maybe not looking so good now. So it's a fundamental sort of philosophical aspect of what is the unit of measurement that you're interested in. And I haven't got any answers, but I just want to flag that up as a really important point to think about. So this is a quick summary of the types of complexity that we're dealing with when we look at some of our farms in our farm business survey data set. So we've just got a snapshot for 1 year. We've got 38 cereal farms who have an average hectare size of 225 in the UK. So in Australian terms, that's tiny, of course. Dairy farms, average hectare size of 117. And this is the sort of complexity of land use that these farms have. So this is what the average arable farm in the east of England looks like. Half of it's winter wheat, another chunk of winter oilseed rape that is now a lot less for reasons of regulations around neonicotinoids, sugar beet production, beans, barley, etc. So there's quite a complex land mix going on average. But on individual farms, it can be a lot more simplified, and typically is. And then on dairy farms, we have a lot of forage-based land use, so grazing or silage. Some of it permanent, so it's grass all the time. It's never been cultivated. And some of it temporary, quite a bit of maize going into these systems as well. So there's quite a bit of complexity around some of the data on these relatively small sample sizes. So this is a sort of a picture of the augmentation approach, and this is, I didn't lead on this work. This is the augmentation through colleagues at ADAS and my colleague Steve Ramsden at Nottingham, where we basically took the data and we said, right, well, what does it look like if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions that we're getting per hectare? So we could have picked any metric, as I said, you know, you could look at it per calorie. And then we looked at nutrient inefficiency, so effectively overuse of nutrients going into the production system, and you sort of find this broad correlation between inefficiency of nutrient use and total greenhouse gas emissions coming out per hectare. So what does that tell you? Well, it's probably not too surprising. You know, if you've got more efficient production systems over here, you're going to have less greenhouse gas emissions because you're just using less inputs. So there was sort of something in this augmentation approach, but I wouldn't say it's a perfect outcome. But it's what we had. And so there is a drive that, you know, if we can reduce this overuse of nutrients, we'd get a better efficiency. And there's a lot of work all over the world that will show you how much farmers are overutilising fertiliser inputs. And if they were to utilise fewer fertiliser inputs, they would actually be not only environmentally better off, but economically better off as well. some of the things within our farm business survey records, we have a lot of data on economics. We have quite a bit of data on physical production outputs. We know about land use. We have some data on physical inputs, but we have all of the data on the cost of inputs. But there are other things, so biodiversity indicators. We don't measure how many beetles there are or how many birds there are, but we do know something about land use. So we know stuff about woodland, for example. We know stuff around how much of the total area is actually used for agriculture. So, on the one hand, we had some data, we joined it with some modelling approaches of looking at environmental outputs, and on the other side of it, we had a long history of undertaking this benchmarking activity for farmers. So, this is a free-to-use website. I'm not going to go into it at the moment, but if you want to, you can go into it, and you can start to see the data that we present that farmers and advisors can go in, and they can benchmark their performance at farm level, farm business level, or at an enterprise level to see how they compare with the average for that type of farm or that enterprise, but also how they compare with the top 25% of producers. So you can go in there as a farmer, and very quickly you can put your own data in to any extent that you want, and you can compare yourself to others in the data set. It's a sealed down system, so that means that farmers, when they're putting their data in, we don't harvest their data. We simply allow them to use the site to look at how they compare, but we don't take their data away from them for two reasons. One, because we don't have any ownership of their data if they haven't consented to give us it. But more importantly, the data that we have in our Farm Business Survey data set is highly validated. I can't tell you how many thousand checks there are, quality checks embedded in there. And the last thing we want is for a farmer to go in here and put in a number that makes no sense by mistake and then throw the whole data set into chaos. So it's the actual sort of tying it down and making it entirely valid is really important to us. So we know about benchmarking. We've got a long history of doing that and making it accessible to farmers. We've previously undertaken some work around environmental benchmarking, and we developed an environmental and social benchmarking tool building on this work on sustainable intensification, and we refined it through some focus groups and talking to farmers as well about how they might want to use it. And so we've refined what we've done through a number of stages, basically. So if after today you want to go on to the Sustainable Intensification Benchmarking site that we have, so this is the web address for it, benchmarkmyfarm.co.uk. I'm just going to go through a little bit of what this is all about. You have to register for the site, but it's free to use. The reason that you have to register for this site is that it's a little bit more complex, and we wanted to ensure that when people had invested time in putting their data into it, that they could save their own data and come back to it, because fundamentally this site is just more demanding than our previous site, and we recognised at the outset that people would come to it, and if they had to fill in everything all in one go, they'd probably give up. So we purposefully made it so that they have to register for a number of reasons, but most fundamentally because we wanted them to be able to come back to it. So the main focus of our sustainable intensification website is around the top two. It's around environmental indicators, and it's around environmental metrics and around social indicators. And just to dwell on that a little bit, with environmental aspects, I think we've got some metrics. How confident we are in those metrics is another matter. But we've got metrics of greenhouse gas emissions. We know about complexity of land use on farms. We know about nutrients going in and coming out of the system, and we've got those metrics. On social aspects, it's really hard. So when you think about sustainability of economics, environment and social, how do you define social? Where do you start? Where do you stop? Is it global? Is it national? Is it individual? And because we were funded by UK government and specifically our Department of Ag and Environment, they were very clear that when they thought about social aspects in this space, they thought about the farmer. And the social aspects of the farmer were what they were worried about. And so you start to tease that out and you go, what does that mean? And you ask policymakers and they say, well, we're worried about isolation. And I say, well, bring it on. I get 100 emails a day, frankly. I'd love a bit of isolation. And they say, no, you're getting the wrong thing here. You know, they're worried about farmers not interacting with other people. They're worried about farmers not engaging in other activities. And so one of the things they were keen to know was, how isolated are these farmers? So that was something that we sort of played around with a little bit and thought, well, what have we actually got in our data set that would allow us to capture it? So I'll come back to that in a moment, but basically, when we're talking about social, because of what we were paid to come up with, it was very much around social as in the farm business. And there are different ways that you can capture stuff on that, but we had to capture something that allowed farmers to compare themselves with what we've got in our data set. So, economics we've already sort of got in the sense of we've got a previous website that farmers can do their economic benchmarking. This looks like a scan, but it's meant to be a waymarker and it's meant to be a benchmark. It's not my picture, but I think I better explain it because otherwise it just looks a bit odd. So the point about it is it's about metrics or indicators. It's using the data source from the Farm Business Survey. And then Mark Reeder, who was mentioned earlier, came up with this great way of not only allowing people to share their data, but also to devise who they want to compare themselves with. And I'll touch on that, which is quite important. So the headline results that we came up with, we are interested in carbon, so greenhouse gas emissions, we're interested in ecology, we're interested in land use diversity, interested in things around fertiliser in terms of related to outputs and inputs, and then the social aspects, as I say, was really around this concept of isolation and opportunities for meeting people at the farm level for a number of reasons, not only just social, but actually do people get out and learn stuff from other people. So we purposely set off with this tool and we thought, well, we want something that we know will work. So here's an important picture. We recognise that people will want to do this on a computer. It's not something you're going to do on a smartphone. It's too complex. We recognise it's heavily data-driven, therefore you're not going to spend a lot of time doing it all in one go, and that every now and again you'll probably need to go and make a coffee and come back to it, or even have a day off. So that was the whole point about registering. We needed people to commit to it and also to ensure their data weren't lost. People can go in and they can get instant results for the whole of England. So you can go into this website and you can see the average metrics for the whole of the data set that we have, so the environmental metrics that we've come up with for the whole of England, but also a user can go in and they can devise their own peer set that they want to benchmark themselves against. So within the data set that we have 1,750 farms and we have 9 main farm types. So cereals is a farm type in our data set. Dairy is a farm type. Pigs are a farm type. General cropping is a farm type. Now these are all sort of groupings that to us mean something. But to an average farmer, they may be growing wheat, they may have some beef animals, they may be growing potatoes, and if you said to them, what kind of farmer are you? They may not know, because they don't have the understanding of the groupings that we have. So this is actually a way of overcoming that and at the same time allowing the farmer to be benchmarked against people who are very similar to their business. So this website actually allows farmers to go in and say, I'm located here, I have got this amount of area of wheat, this amount of sugar beet, this many cows, etc. And the website will find the nearest closest matched farm businesses to your farm. And when I say closest matched, it's largely around the production activities that you have or the land use that you have. And to some extent, it draws on the region that you're in the country as well. So it's quite a clever way of coming up with a peer benchmarking set.
So how many farms do you sort of connect yourself to?
No less than 25. Okay. So I think that's what Mark set as a minimum. So you can go in and you can play, you can go in and look, but the more data you put in, the more you get out. And we also wanted to show that people were getting more out of it as they put more into it. So we devised a system whereby you had a progress bar, a bit like when you're filling in some online survey, but you've got a series of ticks as you went along the way to show you that you'd completed a section and you'd got an answer. Then you could complete another section and you'd get an answer. So we wanted to make it clear, we wanted to make it free, but also secure. So this is the benchmarking thing that I was talking about. So you put in your data, you tell the system what your farm is like. The benchmarking tool then searches our farms, and at the time we had about 2,000 farms in the data set. Our samples reduced because of funding since then. And it identifies these similar sets. Now, I don't understand the stuff behind all of this, but if you were to email Mark Reeder at Cambridge, he'd merrily send you a very long email explaining how it works. But basically, it looks at your production system and it looks at those other businesses similar to it within one standard deviation of your farm's activities, comes up with a set of peers with a minimum of 25. It could be more, depending on the results set. But it will typically be a unique set of businesses that you're comparing yourself with each time. It's not going to be just the simple set. And again, it avoids simplistic farm classifications. And sometimes those farmers just won't know what those classifications are anyway. And even, I mean, I get questions from farmers saying, well, what actually is the definition of this grouping? And I have to scratch my head and go, oh, I think it's maybe this, because sometimes I lose track of which ones and how they're defined. So why would somebody who's not familiar with it have any chance of getting there? If anybody wants to know anything about technical stuff, then don't ask me. I'm basically a technophobe, so I don't really understand how it all works. But it does something like this. It does lots of stuff. There's lots of complicated bits behind it. And again, Mark Reed is the person who will happily talk you through it. This is just something I had to get him to draw so that we could try and explain it to people. So the process is, when you go into it, it's not a all-singing, all-dancing fancy website that has been developed by a web company. It's been developed by Mark. We've had some input from experts in the area, but largely speaking, it is simple, clear and uncluttered, because that's all we had in terms of the resources. You go in and you register. It's quite a secure way of coming up with your password purposefully. And this is the progress bar. So when you go into the site, we have devised this progress bar that basically has these different sections. And as you go through, you'll have the FPS values. So these are the average values from your peer set, as once you've defined what your farm is all about. And then the more data that you put in, it will start to populate your values in here. And once you've filled in a section, it will give you a tick here, and it will say, okay, you've now done your carbon metrics, you've now done your MP and Ks, you've now got your land use diversity, etc. So you can go through as a user, and you can get to the end, and then you can, this is a summary output, and there is much more detailed output that you get beyond that. But the whole point of that is really just to keep people interested, and it's a purposeful part of the design that we had to actually ensure that we were not losing people. So it's basically, you go in and it looks like a spreadsheet. So we have some sustainability measures, as we call them. This is just around what's going on your farm. You can go in. This is telling you what the average is for the farm from the Farm Business Survey. This is telling you how many of the farms within our data set have got this activity. So from our 2,000 farms, 560 were growing winter wheat, for example. 250 were growing either oat, rye or triticale. All sorts of other things, so how much of your area is organic, what percentage of your farm area is rented in rather than being owned, for example. Now this is where people like Mark, who's really a technical whiz kid, so to speak, gets to it, and I look at it as a user and I go, I'm never going to get there. He said, well, we need to get people to put in their location, so we need them to put in their eastings and northing coordinates. And I said, this isn't going to work. The average farmer is not going to know what their coordinates are. So this is an example where we could go to quite extreme degrees of geolocation, or a user could, but actually they're unlikely to know that. So I basically said we're going to have to go down to some sort of level that they can get a handle on. So we know which county they're in. Oh, sorry, they know which county they're in. We just get them to enter that, and it's an approximation. If they want to override it, by the way, they can do, but most of them will go in and they will just do this. So you go in and you put your details in. So, for example, the top one is in pounds. So this is the total farm business cost. So you could get your set of management accounts out and you could say, what are my total business costs? And you put them in the right-hand column. And then you start and you populate as much or as little as you want. So, for example, how many litres of diesel have I bought? Now, the more you get into this, the more complex it is. And this is typically going to be something that farmers who are either really interested in this or will use, or more likely an advisor will want to use for some purpose. So it's more along the lines of your average farmer is not going to instantly jump to this, but they may move on to it once they've got into some sort of business benchmarking. But a lot of these things, they will have data on. They will know how many litres of diesel they've bought. They will know how much electricity they've used, if they can drill down to the receipts. They've got a rough idea of how much straw has been sold off farm. They'll certainly know how many tons of cereals they've produced. So a lot of these things they will either have data on, and increasingly farmers are collecting a lot more data, or they'll be able to find it, or they'll be able to make a good guess. So they go through the system, and once they've filled everything in, they will get this summary sheet will fill out. So for the peer set of an individual farm, the carbon equivalents that have been produced are 179 tonnes. For my farm, it's 248, for example. I've completed that section, and so it goes on. This land use diversity, it's derived around a Shannon index, for those of you that are interested in it. What does this mean? It means that my land use here is slightly more diverse than my peer set. That's a good thing, okay, from a biodiversity perspective. The social thing, as I touched on, we really struggle to understand what this might be, and we could have picked a number of aspects, but one of the things that we have in the Farm Business Survey is, are you part of a farm assurance scheme, in the sense of, is your production assured by some independent regulator? Well, actually, within my peer set, all of them are, and so am I. We could have picked some other activity here. So we could have said, do you have any diversified activity that means that people are coming onto your farm? So it could be a farm shop, or it could be a livery, or some other type of diversified activity that allows people to say yes or no. How much of my land is uncropped, for example? This is just one headline figure from each of these areas. And then as a user goes into it, they can see much more about their own usage. So CO2 equivalent emissions from nitrogen fertiliser, tonnes per year, 119, minor 200. I'm comparing myself with 31 farms, and within here, if you click on the little graphic, it will give you a distribution, and it will say roughly where you are on that distribution.
So the group changes?
The group will stay the same.
So I've got the numbers changing, the number of my, so I've got 33 farms or something, and of which only 6 are doing.
So in this set here, by the looks of it, this example has got 33 farms in the peer set. 31 of them are using nitrogen fertiliser, 2 of them aren't. So 2 of them must be organic farms for some reason that have crept into this peer set, I think. And therefore they're not bringing in N fertiliser. So it's not that they are not creating CO2 equivalents from their activities, but they're just not buying it in. Does that make sense? So here, for example, so of my 33, only 6 of them have got grazing livestock, and the others have got no grazing livestock at all. So it's just showing you. So in this example, we've suppressed the number for confidentiality reasons anyway. It would have been pretty meaningless. But so, in a nutshell, what we've tried to do is we've tried to look at this really hard thing, in my mind anyway, around sustainability, because it's so complex. We have tried to devise a way in which farmers who are really interested or advisors can go in and they can use typical farm business survey data or farm business production data that a farmer will have. They can populate this free-to-use website, and they can come up with some measures by which they can then say to the person who's buying their products or the person who's supplying them with products, this is what my environmental footprint looks like in these aspects. This is what some of the social indicators look like. And they can start to use it as a way to actually say, well, actually, why am I using, or why am I generating so much more carbon from my fertiliser purchases and my peer set? What's going on there? So it's not a be-all and end-all in terms of answers, but it does allow people to go in and play around with it. There are massive issues around the data quality, and the validity of all of that is really important. So we don't harvest any of the farmer's data in here. There is a function within the website where a farmer can get together with a group of other farmers or advisors and say, we want to share our data within our group. So if there are 6 farmers, they have the functionality to go in, create a group, and say, let's share our data and see how we compare to each other as our peer set, rather than the peer set that we've got. So there is some further functionality within here. The peer benchmarking is, to our understanding, fairly novel. If anybody else has come across it, then please tell me. We think it's fairly novel. We've tried to make it as easy as possible to go in. And I say right at the start, benchmarking for me is not about giving you the answers. It's really just about highlighting areas that you can then go in and do more further investigation into. So the great thing about this was that it pulled together a lot of different ways of looking at data. It pulled together a lot of different people. The downside to it is that as with many research projects, there's a chunk of funding that comes to do it. Then the funding comes to an end, and then they don't think about the legacy of it. So at the moment, I'm paying for this site to exist and to be updated, and the government hasn't come up with any money yet. And so at some point, this is probably going to disappear, because if nobody's going to be willing to fund it, then I'm not going to keep it going on my own steam. So I hope that's been of some vague interest. As I say, part of the challenge is that I don't actually do the research anymore myself. I'm typically just managing projects and talking to people who actually do this stuff. And so, by all rights, it should have been Mark Reeder who'd come back over here to give it. But I'll end. Thank you.